Hey everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm not sure when you're listening to this, but I'm hoping to deliver an Advent Christmas kind of sermon today. I was going to be doing this at our meeting face to face that was going to happen on the 20th, but well, tier 4 lockdown restrictions changed quite a lot of plans that are more important than that one, unfortunately. So anyway, I was going to start by looking back at the Advent sermon I did last year when we were in Project B, down in the centre of town. A sermon which it seems a number of people have remembered, actually. I've had a few people mention it to me throughout the year, which is good. What was perhaps less good was the only thing anyone could remember was they ended with a story about Santa Claus punching people in the face. Which I'm not really sure was the exact intended message of the sermon, but what can you do? As it turned out, though, that story where the familiar and the comfortable in the form of Santa Claus was recontextualized into something that was both kind of frightening and somewhat farcical was actually a much more prescient story for 2020 than I realized at the time. I'm sure you would agree it's been a very strange year. Many of us have spent a lot of time in very familiar, very comfortable surroundings, like my living room, where I have been for most of the year, it seems. But it's all been played out at this kind of weird technological distance, like I'm talking to you through a computer screen now rather than face to face. And many of us have our work, our relationships with our family and our friends has been sort of mediated through this strange mix of the familiar and the unfamiliar, all played out against the background of sort of uncertainty and confusion and fear. And if that's been your experience, I want to offer you an Advent sermon where we look at three things, focusing on Jesus as our King. I want to look at Jesus as King over our fears, as King over our confusion, and as King over our future. So, first one first, we want to look at how Jesus is King over our fear. I think a lot of people have probably been afraid at different points this year. The world's had to face up to its mortality in a way that we rarely have had to. We've been faced with an enemy that we can't see, we can't really fight, and we can't reason with. And dealing with this has created disruption in how we live our lives. People have been worried not just about their health, but also their relationships, their finances. It's all changed in new and unexpected ways. And I'm afraid I'd be an idiot if I was to just stand here and tell you, hey, the only thing you have to do is don't worry about it. Don't be afraid. Similarly, I'd be a liar if I was to stand here and tell you that if you make Jesus your King, he will make sure everything will turn out okay in this earthly life. And you won't need to be afraid. I'm not, unfortunately, here to be able to promise you a complete end to your fears. But what I can offer you is a man whose kingship will allow you to transcend your fears, allow you to see beyond them, and allow you to put them into the right perspective. So there's a couple of ways he does that. Firstly, Jesus had empathy for our problems and fears. The book of Isaiah, chapter 40, which is written hundreds of years before Jesus' earthly birth, he tells us about his character. It says, like a shepherd, he will tend his flock. In his arm he will gather the lambs and carry them in his bosom. You see, Jesus is a king who cares about the individual problems of the individual sheep in his flock. And we can see that through the gospel accounts of his incarnation. In Matthew 14, there's an example. Jesus is out on a boat on a lake, lands on the shore, and it says, when Jesus landed, he saw a large crowd. He had compassion on them and he healed their sick. The Bible tells us repeatedly we have a king and a high priest who has compassion on us and cares about our problems. Now, sometimes people see God as this kind of detached being, like an old man with a beard on a cloud high up in the sky, who's not really affected by what's going on the earth. But I don't think that's correct. Humans feel emotions, and I believe those emotions are dim shadows of the emotions that God feels. God, I believe, is saddened and hurt by the things that sadden and hurt us. The God of the universe, your King Jesus, cares about you. The second part of how Jesus is king over our fears is his kingdom perspective. Gives us a perspective that will transcend our fears. Doesn't remove them, but allows us to see beyond them. In 2 Corinthians, we're told, "For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all." So we fix our eyes not on what we see, but what is unseen. For what is seen is but temporary, and what is unseen is eternal. So I think we ought to look at what this verse isn't saying, first of all. So, it's not saying if you make Jesus your king, you won't have any troubles. It's not saying that your troubles aren't real or that they don't matter. It's not saying that God will sort out all of your troubles in the end, so you don't need to worry. It is saying that you will have troubles, but those troubles have 2 characteristics. The first is that compared to the glory that awaits you, these troubles are only light and momentary. And the second is that it's actually these troubles that are achieving for you this future glory. They're the mechanism by which this glory is created. So I want to tell you today to make Jesus your king and to know a new perspective that will transcend your fears. So, second point, Jesus as king over our confusion. Fear breeds confusion, and when we're unsettled, we tend to look around desperately trying to make sense of what's going on. And I think this has resulted in incredible polarisation amongst people. It can feel like the people we know and love and trust are not operating in the same reality as us. I know a guy who is a really good friend, is a really good man, is very reliable, but I don't always agree with him. And he told me earlier in the pandemic that he thought that COVID had been created in a lab, and it was a conspiracy by a load of rich and powerful people to strengthen their grip over the world. He believed that Bill Gates would be the one who would eventually uncover the vaccine, and this would be a prelude to Bill Gates being unveiled as the Antichrist, the false saviour of humanity that rescued us from COVID. I'm not sure on that. I haven't spoken to him about that topic recently, but I might have a chat with him in a few months and see if that's still his line of thinking. Now, that kind of stuff might seem a bit silly to you, but it's true that there are these huge and important things happening in the world that none of us really understand, and this can be quite scary. Maybe my friend's beliefs don't seem that silly to you, and I mean, well, are there groups of powerful people at work behind the scenes doing bad things? Yeah, there are. And we as little people often can't see what's going on. We find it hard to know who to trust, what to trust, which way to turn, what to believe. As this pandemic wasn't sort of polarising enough, this year we've also seen the continued clashing of visions over Brexit, which people get very emotionally invested in sometimes, and also the rise in prominence of issues of social and racial injustice. And I think many of us have found that the way we see the world isn't shared by people who have a different lived experience to us. Sometimes it feels that people are almost operating in a very different reality to us for various different reasons. There are these huge tectonic plates shifting underneath our society, and it can be really hard to know, where does God want me to stand in all of this? And in these kind of confusing times, people want to turn to certainty. It's good to know for definite what's going on. We want a simple, understandable answer. We want to split issues down into being right and wrong, where there are goodies and baddies. And it is very tempting to follow a person or an idea that gives you that kind of certainty. It's very tempting, in fact, to exchange certainty for truth. And certainty is really comforting. And I understand that, but is not the same thing as truth. The Apostle Paul was one of the greatest Christians who ever lived, a man who met the resurrected Christ face to face. But he was a man who often didn't understand what was going on. In 1 Corinthians 13, he tells us we can only see through a glass darkly. A bit later in the same chapter, he talks about how even if I understood all mysteries and had all knowledge, making the clear implication that wasn't anywhere near his level of understanding. But Paul lived out his life following Christ, not understanding often the wider plans and counsels of God. But if you read his writings, this doesn't really seem to have troubled him that much. We can see scattered examples of this maybe in 2 Corinthians 12, where he prays repeatedly for God to remove what we think is a physical illness from him, which doesn't happen, and he doesn't really get an explanation why either. Or in Romans 15, where you can see that his plans for his ministry to Rome have obviously repeatedly failed to come to fruition, and he doesn't know why. What comes across, though, and why these kind of scattered hints throughout his writings, is he doesn't dwell on it because it doesn't really seem to bother him. Paul was quite happy living in a confusing world, because although he didn't have certainty, he had truth. So what is truth? It's a famous question, famously asked by Pontius Pilate at Jesus' trial. Ironically asked at Jesus' trial because Pilate seemed unaware that the answer was actually standing directly in front of him. Jesus tells us in John 14, I am the truth. And so that's what I want to offer you today. Make Jesus your king, and he will be your truth, regardless of the confusion in the world. Truth, you see, is not a concept or a set of values or a set of data. Truth is a man. And to know Jesus, to know that man, is to know the truth. Doesn't mean you know the answer to everything. You may end up being completely on the wrong side of an important issue. You may end up completely missing the point of something or get caught up in some very silly ideas. But what will matter more is that you will know truth on a fundamental level. You will have an assurance that no matter how confusing the world gets, you will have a hope and a future in that truth. Make Jesus your king today, and you will know the assurance of his truth in a confusing world. Now, something I wanted to look at is if you're listening to this and you're not a Christian, you may think that I'm falling into what Christians are often accused of, which is encouraging people not to think, not to question stuff, not to worry about why things are happening, but just believe, have blind faith, and do what your church leaders tell you. And if that's how you're feeling at the moment, I just want to clarify that I'm not telling you not to think or to turn off your brain. I'm asking you in humility to recognise the smallness of human reasoning compared to the vastness, the breadth, the depth and the richness of God's way of thinking. It's not thinking, but it's sort of guiding your own thinking in its proper place with humility. I'm not telling you don't think about stuff. I'm not telling you to turn off your brain. In fact, what I am telling you is that Christianity actually stands as a rejection of the whole paradigm of post-Enlightenment thought, which attempted to deify human reasoning. And instead of a truth that is reasoned empirically, we're offering you a model of truth that is fundamentally existential and teleological in its character. So I'm not asking you not to think about things, but I am asking you to think of your own thinking in a humble manner when compared to the vastness of the thinking of God. You can still think, but I want to tell you, if you make Jesus your king, then you will know truth in a confusing world. So, point 3. Jesus as king over our future. We've had a look, I believe, at how Jesus can be the king over your fears, allowing you to transcend them, and the king over your confusion, allowing you to regard it in a different manner than you would have previously. But my primary selling point for you today, if you want to look at this in a mercantile fashion, is if you make Jesus your king, he will give you a hope and a future, no matter what your earthly circumstances are. I want to use an illustration of a guy in the Bible who's interesting for 2 reasons. 1, his circumstances are on the earth are really bad, and 2, his response to them is not actually perhaps what you would expect. So I'm talking about the thief on the cross. We can read about him in Luke 23. He only gets a few lines about him in Scripture, but what we know about him is that he's being executed on a cross, and he's a thief. And so the reason he's being executed is his own kind of bad decisions and poor behaviour. So things on the earth are not going well for this guy, to be honest. But if we follow his story, maybe he's going to do something amazing and turn things around. There's going to be a last-minute, heroic change. Let's have a look. He turns to Jesus and he says to him, "Will you remember me when you come into your kingdom?" Okay. Is that it? Is it? I've got the right story. Yeah, that's it. That's all he does. I mean, it's not that impressive. It's not that heroic. If we were watching a film of this, I don't think we'd hear like triumphant music playing in the background, would we? It's a pretty wimpy request, Will you please remember me? That's all he says. Let's see how Jesus responds, though. Jesus turns to the thief and he says to him, "Truly, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." That's it. That was all the thief needed to do. All that was required to begin an eternity in perfect peace, joy and love in the presence of the King of the universe. Now, the thief's earthly situation is still not good, to be honest. He's still on that cross. He's going to be dead in a few hours. But because of those few simple words, he, at this very moment that you're listening to this sermon, he's more alive than you or I have ever been. He's currently seated in heavenly places, assured of an eternal hope and a future. It was all he needed to do was to turn to Jesus and ask him to remember him. All he needed to do, and all we need to do. So, in this sermon, we've looked at, as I say, 3 ways in which Jesus is king. King over our fears, king over our confusion, and king over our future. And at Christmas, we'll probably sing songs about telling of the newborn king born today. And I want to encourage you this Advent to make Jesus your king. You may have done this already, but if you haven't, I want to advise you to look at what's going on in the world, the confusion, the fear, the uncertainty over the future, and to take all of that to the man who is the king of the universe and who today wants to be your king and also your friend. So if you find yourself in that situation, I want to pray for you on the other side of this screen, that this Advent you would know the newborn king and his kingship would transcend all of the difficulties and the problems and the confusion and the hopes and the fears of this earthly world and allow you to see the eternal perspective. Okay, Merry Christmas everybody. I will speak to you again soon.